Ithinar's Bloom by H. Jane Harrington. Chapter 33. Brief Weaving. Treat your sword as you would your manhood. Oil occasionally, handle with care, and whip it out as needed. Master Kezias. "Where's Toma?" Vaughn asked as Malachar placed a coin on the counter. The grain master accepted it and pulled a sack of rice from the shelf behind him. "Where else?" Keir snorted, trying to populate the central aisles with his little bastards, no doubt. She heaved the sack to her shoulder as the merchant turned to fetch the remainder of their order. "Cut the man some slack, Keir," Malachar said lightly. "There's no room for slack," she grumbled, shooting a wary look at the grain master's back. They had agreed to guard their tongues and refrain from using titles while in the presence of others. The last thing they needed was for Vaughn to be recognized. "He's got a job to do, which can't be done while he's occupied betwixt the sheets." The merchant produced 2 more bundles and placed them on the counter. Malachar promptly tossed the sacks over his shoulder. Keir doffed her hat to the grain master, then followed the men onto the boardwalk. They made their way to the row of 5 horses that waited patiently at the post. Keir and Malachar loaded their bundles onto the pack horse, then Malachar secured them with a leather strap. Keir watched the new guardian as he checked over his sorrel's tack. It was still difficult to accept him as a member of their group. Keir's reasons were entirely personal, and her reservations were born out of selfishness. She hated the constant reminders of her past. And though it appeared that Malachar had accepted Keir's status as guardian, he still harbored ill feelings toward her. She understood. Nobody could possibly hate Keir more than she hated herself. The tension on the air between them was thick as buttercream. Malachar would do his job and he would tolerate her, because he was an honorable man. But Keir wondered if the strain between them would ever truly dissipate. Despite his attitude, he'd proven quite useful, and not only during Galvatine's attack. He'd provided an instant source of funding. Queen Palinor had sent him with plenty of lorens, which they had used to buy 4 more mounts and a spacious tent. The horses would shave off time from the trip and save blisters on the heels. "That's the last of the supplies," Malachar said. "Let's go find a tavern and relax while we await Skillio." "That could take all night," Keir commented gruffly. "I don't think our master bard would leave us in a predicament. I'm sure he won't be long," Vaughn assured her. As the men crossed the street toward a nearby tavern, Keir retreated to a bench outside the grainmaster's shop. She set her short sword in her lap for easy access, then crossed her arms and leaned back against the wall. "Aren't you coming, Keir?" Vaughn asked. "Nope. Somebody's got to guard the horses and supplies," she replied. Malachar hesitated. "You don't have to sit there forever. I'll relieve you in a while." Keir shrugged, feigning indifference. "Whatever suits you." She watched as the 2 men disappeared behind the doors of the alehouse. She scanned the street, eyeing the assortment of merchant shops and street vendors, whose wares were spread upon blankets, tables, and upright boards. The street was rather empty, save for a handful of passers-by and browsers. An occasional airskiff whooshed by, though most of the vehicles in this market town were simple wagons. Airskiffs were expensive, and most common merchants could not afford the magic-powered vessels. The merchant on Keir's left, his wagon situated at the end of the boardwalk, was busy weaving on a loud, clacking loom inside the enclosed vehicle. A little Demishuan slave girl, probably no older than 5, stood silently behind a table cluttered with various woven pot-holders, rugs, and cloths. She was clutching a doll made of woven remnants tightly to her chest. The merchant's table was void of customers, but the child's eyes were busy anyway. They darted hopefully up and down the street as though she was searching for someone. After a moment, the girl's sweeping gaze met Keir's. Much to Keir's surprise, the child smiled and waved a tiny hand in greeting. Keir smiled tentatively and waved in return. Few children ever paid her much mind. The child must have taken the acknowledgement as an invitation to approach, because she was at Keir's side instantly. She sat down and gave Keir another wide smile. Keir raised an eyebrow, but shrugged. If the kid wanted to sit beside her, the bench was plenty big enough for 2. They sat in silence for a few moments. It seemed awkward. Keir wasn't used to children and didn't really know what to say. She turned her attention to the horses, watching them intently. After several moments, the girl scooted closer. Keir's forced smile began to fade. What in the world could the child want? For a brief second she wondered if the kid might be a pickpocket. Rather young for such a trade, but the best nabbers usually started out that way. Kira watched the girl from the corner of her eye as a tiny hand extended toward her. The woven rag doll was in the child's outstretched hand. The child's pride radiated in her smile, and Kira realized that the girl was offering the doll for her consideration. Kira looked it over appraisingly, smiling with feigned interest. She bobbed her head in approval, much to the child's delight. After a few moments of frisking the doll across her lap in mock play, she returned it. The girl stared at her expectantly, as though waiting for something. Being a slave, she probably had no friends and had been looking for a playmate. Kira could not exactly provide her that, but she could keep the friendly exchange going. The girl had shared a bit of her own pride, so Kira decided to return the favor. Taking her short sword from her lap, she offered it. The delight in the child's crimson eyes was obvious, and she accepted the sheathed weapon graciously. Just as Kira had inspected the doll, the girl turned the sword over and over in her hands, her tiny fingers rubbing over every finely etched detail. When she was finished, she nodded, mimicking Kira's earlier impression. She handed the weapon back gratefully. Kira inhaled deeply, pleased at the exchange. Somehow, the simple act of sharing had lightened her heart a degree. A customer approached the loom master's table, and the girl raced back to her post. She waved a hand in farewell, then turned to conduct dealings with the prospective buyer. Kira chuckled and shook her head. She threw her gaze to the tavern across the street. To her chagrin, she spied Malachar and Vaughn through the paned glass of the alehouse's large window. They had both been watching her, and both appeared all manner of amused. Her cheeks flushed, and she scowled in embarrassment. Quidnuncs, the both of 'em. Gonna gossip away like old ladies want a quilt ring. Kira muttered aloud to herself. And I'm sure they'll have a good laugh with Skilly over this. Kira likes to play with dolls. I can just hear it now, wenching quidnuncs. Their heads disappeared from the window. After a few minutes, Malachar stepped out of the tavern and made his way toward her. He couldn't wait for the ribbon, could he? Kira thought with a grimace. Had an idea, Malachar said as he approached.